Of Kittens and Broken Things, Chapter 11. Russ got the alert that they were leaving in 2 days, vague resentment brewing strong in his gut and bleeding off slow in his throat. Too many hinky things were wedging themselves under his plates and twisting. The Normandy was beautiful and sleek, and he wanted her himself. But the sauce. Cerberus made him ill. He couldn't shake that Shepard was the fruit of the poisoned tree, and the ship a trap. He could do a lot about the ship, and had, but Shepard herself? So much riding on this fragile, soft-spoken woman. She was not anything he expected. He'd gone with Liara, heard Liara's stories, and had been inclined to believe them. He'd heard Garrus's stories, and had been inclined to believe them, though he was always distracted by Garrus. Distracted. Sure, Russ. Let's use that word. Russ had met Garrus during mandatory military service, years before Garrus was in CSEC, long before Garrus was on the SR-1. Russ was newly arrived, 15 years old. Garrus was older than Russ by 5 years, and a Vicarian. Intimidating to Russ's small clan sensibilities. He rarely looked at Garrus's face, never in the eye. Russ's size had always been a benefit, his speed and his intelligence the pride of his smaller and much more obscure clan, Yansak. Newly at training, all that accustomed status was gone. Without any status among his peers, and with him being from the most obscure clan, he was quiet and nervous. Russ's parents had great hopes for him, and he'd had no idea how much ambition, until he was in military service, far from home and far from their influence. So when Garrus Vicarian met Hemoris Yansak, Russ had been at the worst point of his idealistic, sorry, pain-filled life. Russ was a biotic and did not know it because his parents had him implanted in childhood with an illegal, difficult-to-detect biotic inhibitor. Turned out, this was a common surgical procedure with potential biotic Turian children. Ambitious parents resorted to risky and illegal surgery. Unfortunately and infuriatingly, the practice still continued. Garrus did what he could from the Citadel to educate and prosecute, but it was a cultural blind spot. Since it sometimes worked, it was considered best for the child. Sometimes it made the problem and potential go away. They used Asari dampening technology of the sort developed by slavers. Dampen a biotic child long enough, and some of them lost the capacity to use the ability, many never knowing they had it at all. How do you prove or find a negative? Only from the failed cases. Russ was a failed case. He had a history of ever-worsening headaches that had resulted from the hidden implant. He just didn't know that at the time. According to his doctors and his parents, there was no treatment, only suffering and silence. That's what he was taught, and that's all he knew. Turians fought hurt. Turians sacrificed. He was a Turian. If he were entirely honest with himself, it's still what he knew. He'd learned to deny all pain. He'd learned to accept the judgment of his elders and the authorities. He took pride in his endurance. Add to the self-immolating package that he was gay and in denial because that's another thing a good Turian heir did. He was the only child of his parents. They impressed upon him constantly that the sacrifices they'd made for his welfare were to be paid back with a high interest rate in the future to his clan. Although he had status in his clan, he did not have friends. Shy around boys, confused around girls, relying on the guidance of his parents, who had him scheduled every minute of every day. That was another thing he had learned later. Parents who performed this atrocity on their kids were advised to drive their children to exhaustion, often for their own good. Given that a biotic's metabolism required a great deal of energy, the theory was that biotics would not be able to express themselves in a child that was kept tired and undernourished. So when he'd entered military training, the implant that he did not know about was mechanically and traumatically breaking down. The biofilm coating was ruptured and the internal capsule eroding, direct ESO exposure and other components causing a slow but increasingly virulent systemic reactive allergy to develop, along with resurgent and uncontrollable biotic flares. For the first time in his life, his diet was not restricted, and he was eating now for two, him and his fucked-up antibiotic implant. The headaches that had built for years were now constant and intense, but he'd never missed a damned day of training. He was proud of it. He was resented by his fellow recruits because of his ease of proficiency and lack of any social skills. Female recruits pursued him, but he was not only not interested, but terrified of what they would represent in his life, arbitrary power over him. Any free time he had was spent in a bunk trying not to throw up. And now, horrified as sheets of blue formed on his skin, and he woke to see them vaporize, hoping they were just a dream, with a growing fear that it was a sustained nightmare. He'd progressed in a few brief weeks from trying not to die during training to hoping he would, blearily keeping his balance and gritting focus on not falling over. Garrus Vakarian noticed and would not accept his customary denial and explanation of chronic, intractable headaches about which nothing could be done. Garrus was his arms instructor, Russ trying to stumble his way through training, his ambitions slowly degrading from excelling to just getting the fuck through a day somehow, minute by minute. Russ was high in the rankings because he would heroically focus while testing, even though he was ashamed because he knew he could do better. He heard his father's voice in his head often saying, "Heroes don't blame the pain, they overcome it." He let himself drift. He told himself he could for just a few moments because he was proficient at this particular weapon, and instruction on something he'd pass without doubt could not compete with the increasingly stabbing headache, now affecting his vision. Normally he'd try to do what he could to ease the pain, but letting himself drift this time did not result in a relaxed stupor or ease his headache at all. He was watching the last desperate hope that it would ever ease slip away, facing timeless suffering where a night in a bunk seemed eternal damnation and a curse from whatever spirits he had failed. Garrus must have tried to get his attention, but Russ was drifting to the left in his alcove, about to fall, and Garrus grabbed his arm to keep him standing. Disoriented and startled, Russ had tried to pull away, and some horrifying self-defense feat of rage at being touched knocked Garrus Vakarian off his feet and far away in a blue maelstrom. Russ's first thought was, just fucking kill me. He couldn't see straight, but he did know he was an abomination and he'd just assaulted his instructor. Worst-case scenario, which seemed to be his life up to this point, he should be beaten to death, his body dragged somewhere as a lesson to others. Please. Instead, Garrus moved slowly to a sitting position and spoke quietly from the ground.
It's Yansok, right, Russ?
Sounded like a trap. Don't answer. Whatever you say, he'll use it against you. Russ didn't move, and only thought, just fucking kill me. Quickly. Please. Don't beg. Garrus waved everyone else away, waited while the fascinated filed out, leaving Russ and Garrus alone on the range.
Russ, I need to get you to a doctor.
Russ shook his head, and the pain scattered and resettled in brighter shards. Doctors can't fucking help me.
Not the ones you've met, that I'm sure. Someone new. Russ, your pupils are blown. Something is wrong.
That sounded to be about the funniest thing Russ had ever heard. Something being wrong when the word was everything, but laughing hurt. He laughed anyway, slid to the floor because if he was going to die, doing it from there would be better. From there it got hazy. Garrus's voice calm, with Russ not remembering if he had only thought about begging Vicarian to make sure he never woke up, or if he'd actually said it. Then it went mercifully dark. Garrus was there when he woke up, calmly telling him about the eroded dampener. Garrus had gotten an Asari specialist surgeon who was able to locate the thing. Russ was shocked into silence on several fronts. First, he was being treated like a Taurian and not an abomination by a Vicarian. Second, he had to absorb that he'd always been biotic, would always be a biotic, and apparently powerfully so. According to the Asari's description, the dampener had been illegal, barbaric, and intended to last for 2 years. Based on the model and wear, she thought Russ had it in for at least 13 years. Russ heard the implication in Garrus's calm and careful voice. His parents had done this, had put it in, hadn't sought removal when the pain had consistently overwhelmed him. Maybe they were unable to secure a new one. Maybe they were just ignorant, but they had done this. Maybe the doctors knew. Maybe they were bribed to shut up. Maybe they never found it. But he did know his parents prevented anybody from taking that thing out of him. Russ reviewed his life. Moments of his parents looking at each other, looking at doctors. Determination and denial in retrospect, blatant on their faces and in their voices. He was certain. He was suddenly and coldly, absolutely certain that his parents would rather he die or be in constant pain than be discovered to be a biotic. Garrus assured him recovery would be slow but steady. He then asked Russ a question not a single person in his life had asked him before.
What do you want to do?
Russ was silent for long minutes, a wash of blue over his skin and over his eyes. He stared at the wall opposite Garrus and saw a label on a box on the shelf that said, Orbiston Medical Supply. He decided that was his new name. I want my parents told I'm dead. I want a new name. I want this paint off my face. Garrus did all of that for him without question. Visited every day for the months of rehab and arranged for him to transfer with a new identity to Cabal training. Over time, Russ was able to walk without assistance, freed of crushing headaches, starting to be able to control biotics, and trying to shake off the habits of denial and pain with a more or less healthy and appropriate burn of rage toward his parents, tempered by a well of gratitude toward Garrus. He began to look forward to new opportunities. Garrus was supportive and protective and encouraging. By the time he left for the Cabal, Russ was deeply in love with Garrus Vicarian, who, as far as Russ could tell, saw him only as an unfortunate small clan of unusual size for his age. Russ moved forward in his life, found lovers, but never one who could compete with the impossible standard of a young boy's crush on a man who was the first to show him kindness. Garrus had shown understanding of something inside Russ, something the people who supposedly loved him put inside. Garrus had the experience and faith to find it, and to forgive Russ for knocking him on his ass. Russ's internal image of an invincible Taurian warrior as the most noble goal was replaced by the image of a man sitting in the dirt, calmly convincing a young and desperate boy that he shouldn't have to be in pain, and that help was possible. Garrus was still the only person who had ever asked him what he wanted. Sure, people asked later, but usually in trade once Russ had something to give back. Garrus had saved his life and then listened to a young abomination deny his duty to clan. One more place where Russ was out of control, rageful, and probably deserving to be beaten to death, genuinely uncaring if that happened, but Garrus hadn't argued. He hadn't asked for anything in return. He'd followed up. He'd cared. Russ had a rare talent at a steep price, biotics that had resisted and rebounded off dampening technology. Nobody could be sure how the dampeners affected biotics because there were no studies, obviously, but his were strong and versatile. Could be they started out that way, could be that the interaction with the dampener resulted in alteration. He liked the Cabal recruits. It took some time, but he stopped thinking of them as abominations, started thinking of them and himself as people. He developed new biotic skills and helped others do the same. Nobody cared if he was gay because the bar of respectability had been so far exceeded by biotics and bareface that fuck it was the general attitude. Kids already facing a life of marginalized service and social denial admired his unashamedly bare face. He tried to emulate Garrus's manner, became easygoing and funny, excelled at training, became an instructor himself. There he stayed until Garrus tapped him to help integrate Taurian biotics into C-Sec ranks and training. The fact that Garrus remembered him at all was a massive shock. Garrus had followed his career, sought him out, then worked with him closely and took his advice. Hero worship did not cover what Russ felt for Garrus, but it would do as a reliable cover. Russ did his damnedest to not impose his, not resurgent, but certainly reliably surgent passion on Garrus, but to be of use and of service. Russ would have done anything for Garrus Vakarian. Anything. Something that had been a never-fading, guilty childhood crush gained real legitimacy, a genuine friendship, and Russ having the right to call him a friend. Watching Garrus cut through Citadel politics and prejudice, being proudly associated with a barefaced biotic, had been heady enough, but being told he was trusted and competent, asked as a personal favor to accompany Liara to Sony and help her. Anything you need, Garrus. He liked Liara. Russ was starstruck by the company he was keeping. Yorlis and Jinivek had died when they saved Farron and recovered Shepard's body. Liara said repeatedly that she owed him everything, but he felt it was the reverse. Russ had found another kind, extraordinary person in Liara. Another person he would do anything for, sworn to secrecy because Liara knew, and even Russ knew, Garrus Vakarian was in love with Commander Shepard. Russ had been right there, working with him, had seen the change, had mourned for the life that bled out of Executive Vicarian, less Garrus each day. Those marks on his crest might as well have been in human script saying, "Property of Lal Shepard." He had wished he could do something about it, but Russ would not bring up Commander Shepard's name in any context. He didn't believe she would actually be brought back to life. He wasn't deluded enough to think Garrus would find consolation in Russ's arms. It was a source of heated fantasy, but he never brought that into Garrus's presence. Russ did develop a reputation for seeking out Vicarian lovers of a certain build. This turned out to be a common fad and fetish of many a male and female Turian during Garrus's rise to power, so Russ was only one among many. Vicarians were plentiful and not inclined to complain. Russ listened to Garrus talk about her, believing her to be the pinnacle of human achievement and Turian admiration. He was there with Garrus every day after his return from helping Liara. She and Garrus had both kept Russ busy, and he made a name for himself in one spectacular raid on a slavery ring that worked out of the Citadel. Leading a team, he'd rescued hundreds of Turians at Nimaris. Garrus had set it up, and Liara had gotten the intel, but they both gave him full credit. Garrus sponsored him for Spectre after that mission, and through Garrus's uncanny persuasion that seemed to be supernatural, but Russ easily believed that of him, he was accepted and trained. Once again, Russ would do anything for Garrus Vicarian. So he was a Spectre and a close associate, protege, friend of the Turian counselor, who was still less Garrus each day, until he spoke her name. That was the only time real light came into Garrus's eyes, humor light in his voice. Russ considered Shepard to be more of a spirit, and he enjoyed Garrus's storytelling, his voice. Spirit's his voice. He never got tired of hearing about Shepard. It was when Garrus was most alive. He wasn't jealous because she was a spirit. She wasn't here. She didn't get to hear his voice herself. Russ was the one blessed. So when it became probable that Shepard would be returned to life, with Liara planning to bring her to the Citadel, Russ had to decide what his reaction would be ahead of time. He knew going in that Hemoris Orbiston would do anything for Garrus Vicarian, and Garrus Vicarian would do anything for Lal Shepard. Therefore, by the transitive property, Hemoris Orbiston would be doing everything for Lal Shepard. He hadn't spent years passing as a pain-free, non-biotic heterosexual without picking up some tricks. So he knew the best he could hope for would be to see life soak back into Garrus, and it would be worth it. He was Garrus's friend, and no more. But by every spirit who could hear him, he had not been able to predict how much it would hurt. Garrus and Liara were larger than life and familiar. Lal Shepard was something else, and not something he particularly cared for after the first disorienting shock of meeting a woman who appeared helpless and occasionally shrewd. He would admit some of it was straight-up jealousy, because Garrus Vicarian would do anything for Lal Shepard. And she saw Garrus as a political asset first. Through all the stories told about her, he'd had no idea if Lal Shepard loved Garrus Vicarian back, but it hadn't mattered when she was dead. Now she wasn't dead, and Garrus put his mark on her, bonded to her without question, and she failed to appreciate it. That alone Russ was not certain he could ever forgive her, or would ever stop feeling seething jealousy, holding her responsible for any slight Garrus experienced that she did not compensate for as his Ava. He occasionally remembered that Garrus said he had bonded to her without her consent, but Russ could not imagine someone not being transcendently thrilled by that occurrence, or someone that would not find Garrus impossibly attractive. It had no positive impact on his opinion of her. Russ decided that Garrus must be covering for her coldness, because Garrus was a kind man and would, in fact, do anything for her. The irony of Garrus speaking as though there were to be no secrets in that room, while Garrus was clearly covering for Shepard. Liara always had some faraway moments where she lost the Shepard as goddess narrative, and Russ was one of the biggest offenders of the no secrets rule. Teasing, where he wanted to protest that none of this made sense, and how was it possible that Shepard first did not appreciate Garrus, and second looked like she could barely carry a gun, much less shoot one. She failed to impress. She was fine, he was sure, smart and canny, and that was great, but this was Shepard. She should be more. And this was Garrus telling her he wanted to give her his life and everything in it. And she apologized for it. It all reeked of asterisk. Not only that, but she was distant, cold, and there was something so instinctively off about her that he couldn't shake the bad vibe. Was she always like this, or was it a side effect of being, well, dead and brought back to life by a racist organization? So here he was, ironically living one of his more primal fears, bound to obey a woman he did not care for or trust. He'd earned his own Spectre status and tossed it aside without question because Garrus Vicarian had told him he was the best there was.
I need you on that ship,
was prefaced by that perfect man's voice saying,
I need you.
And that's all Russ had to hear. So she spent days locked away, and Garrus was undercut politically because of her, smelled like helplessness, and not her. Russ felt that resentment burn in his throat, bile and subharmonics. This woman had been given her life back, a ship, the devotion of the best Taurian in existence, and she was silent. He did not understand her supposed allure or intended authority or how, in any hell, she was going to do a fucking thing that Garrus couldn't have gotten done on his own. Say it, Russ. At least be honest here. And gotten done with your help. Fuck. This was about something he hated. Image. He had proven he didn't need a clan, could be who he was without compromising. Except for the fact that you're in love with someone who you will never tell. And she insisted on exactly what she was supposed to do in order to get the job done. No denying that, but at least, you ridiculous woman, smell like your bondmate and do not lock him out of your life. Garrus would be better off without her. He had been on the right track. He hadn't needed more than her memory. The real woman was gonna fail, made of overblown reputation and overhyped life. It was up to Russ to prop her up. He was going to be coldly sacrificed at the altar of a small, fragile woman who somehow, in her history, managed to place one counselor, take the bond of another, and by all appearances appreciate neither. He did not get it. Things that he did not get tended to result in people dying. His subharmonics built to a growl, and he had to do something about that. He was going to be stuck on a ship with people he did not know. Spirits knew if there was going to be another Taurian. Spirits only knew if he was going to live long, but he could not take this anger with him. It wasn't for her. It was for Garrus. He headed to a bar where his reputation and type was well known, where he would not be approached by a woman, and where nearly every Vicarian that frequented the place would know whether or not Russ approved of their build. He was gonna miss the Citadel. He was gonna miss his ship and crew, though he didn't sleep around there. Fine for people of similar rank, not, in his opinion, fine for a Spectre. There was an inherent power imbalance that he was not willing to exploit or be perceived as exploiting. He was acutely aware of the power of hero worship, and now Russ was a hero himself. After Nimeris, he'd gotten a clear view of that. People as grateful to him for saving a cousin or a sister as he had been about Garrus saving him. He was careful, respectful, and cautious of other people's hearts. That said, he didn't mind at all being objectified as an 8-foot-tall, bare-faced Spectre, benefited from it personally. He'd learned very early in his career that he was not going to blend into the crowd. It had been a long time since anybody had told him they objected to his bare-faced status. Instead of being a horrible stigma, turned out it was its own fetish, and he enjoyed having his face touched as though it was sacred or profane. He enjoyed a lot of things. Damned if he was going to miss the opportunity to enjoy them again before they left. He'd been working hard, hadn't been out since Shepard's return. He dropped his frustration and apprehension, focused on letting it all slide in the service of emotional equilibrium. Acting skills were important. Garrus and Shepard would have to work out their relationship, and although it stung to watch them flounder, there was absolutely nothing he could or should do about it. Couldn't deny that he wanted to, though. Always wanted to. He'd barely gotten an ale in a habitual corner booth before Terrace joined him silently, sitting down without being invited. And that was good. Terrace Vicarian was a beautiful man, smart and sharp, mentally and otherwise. Terrace smiled, gestured to the ale, and said, "Drink up. We're leaving." "Can I just bring it with me?" Terrace stood, took the ale, and started to walk out, so that was good. Russ loved this place so much he rarely spent more than 10 minutes here. Terrace drank most of it, but handed it over when they got into the sky car, drove to his place while Russ took appreciative pulls, pacing the rest. "Where the hell have you been?" It was a ritual because he had to respond. "I'd tell you, but I'd have to kill you." Terrace shook his head. So full of shit. Probably something terribly boring. Russ nodded. "Rescue me from my day of sequential napping." Now that sounds like it has potential. Think I could get you for a whole day? Russ looked at him appraisingly. "Of napping? Probably. But I charge extra." "Pfft, you snore. I should get a discount." "I'll give you half my ale." "You're pretty when you're quiet." "Spirits, so are you." Terrace's eyes sparkled at the opening. "Did you know that they now sell voice emulation tailored to certain voices?" Russ grinned. "Don't say it." Terrace shrugged and parked the car, led the way. "You have a thing? I should have a thing. I could sound like a counselor." Russ shook his head. "With my luck, it'd be Valor. Your thing's just fine." Terrace had absolutely no filter and no shame, and Russ enjoyed that as well. Affection and lust, though Terrace had higher ambitions that he repeated but knew would not be reciprocated. It was good to feel wanted. "I'm hurt, Russ. My thing's better than fun, and you should show some respect. Show me the way. I'm going to ask you again. Let's find a pair of female Taurians into each other and all announce our bonding at once. I'm not bonding to you, Terrace. Yet. But thank you for asking. I'll get it right someday. Terrace knew not to tear his clothes because there were no spares here. He wouldn't keep any here, and his clothes were expensive and custom. Russ was allowed to do anything he wanted with Terrace's clothes, so he did, talons out, shredding his shirt, leaning down to lick at his chest. But Terrace stopped him, his hands in the way, carefully unsealing his shirt. You need more zippers in your life, Russ. Russ looked down at Tease and Fuss. Next time, you want zippers? I'll get you zippers, Terrace. Get some zippers. Keep them here. You're awfully good to me. Terrace smiled his I know smile, and carefully took off Russ's shirt with warm palms and scrapes of his talons. Someone should be, Russ. Affection and lust and Vicarian markings. Terrace not caring if he thought about Garrus at all, offering to speak like him because it just might make Russ happy. Fuck, it was a good day to be a Taurian. Russ bent forward with a growl and bit along the hide of Terrace's throat, both sets of hands going to pant fastenings, kicking them away. Russ's plates spread, cock out, gel-coated length of always hard and glad of it, taking it to Terrace's hands. Spirits, yes. Hands were good, but his tongue was better. Terrace on his knees with reverie from the contact simmering into his system and Terrace's with mutual groans. Yeah, Russ had a thing. Had a few things from years with biotics and biotic styles, hot and cold and constricting and electricity on the skin. Terrace would want warm first. Russ's hands lighten up with gentle blue, roaming over Terrace's face. The hide at the sides of his neck, the creases of his shoulders, talons digging in to scratch but not draw blood. Not yet. For now there was warmth, cascading in blue tendrils down Terrace's back and chest, moans and spirits his tongue. Reverie made him anticipate hours of lust and affection, never being apart long enough to allow it to fade. He felt sorry for other species that could only last for a short time, preferring by inclination and experience the long burn of reverie. He'd briefly considered, just for curiosity's sake, what Garrus and Shepard would do for sex, and it seemed unbearable. What the fuck was an orgasm, and what if one of them were allergic? Maybe he was at heart a racist himself. He lightly considered that while spreading palms and biotics, nails and pressure into Terrace's beautiful hide, looking down at the light blue that contrasted with his deeper Vicarian markings and the shimmer of purple in his bone-cast crest. He was fucking perfect. He wasn't a racist, just fucking smug. He couldn't have Garrus, but at least he wasn't Garrus and didn't have to deal with an undead human female in bed. He let those thoughts drift away. Terrace's tongue, endlessly talented as reverie coursed through them both, swelled and crested to the slow, warm, overflowing peak. He waited until Terrace decided what came next, because he had so many ideas for later and wanted to savor them. Next came a long time after, Terrace turning him by the hip spurs to face the wall, one hand gliding along Russ's cock, tongue edging his ass, fingers slipping inside in a long suspended groan of pleasure. Fuck yes. Featherlight, wet caresses and teasing until his talons were digging into the wall, something Terrace said he liked because he could see the marks later, and they made him smile. So very accommodating. His terrace. Teo. Please. This was also a ritual. Please, what? Say it. A haze of anticipatory pleasure as Terrace stood, dragging his teeth along Russ's spine, one hand still on his cock and the other hand scratching along the curve of Russ's thigh up to his waist, drawing blood. Terrace stood up, still significantly shorter than Russ. Everyone was. So he tugged Russ's hips back, away from the wall, offered Russ a talon to lick, waited until he was finished, and said, Please, what? First letter of Russ, also pronounced slightly differently in archaic Palaveni, meaning mine. Russ arched his back, blue, warm flames starting at his shoulders and spreading down as Terrace licked along the spreading heat, plate ridges, and hide. Please, Teo, fuck me before I decide I've had enough teasing, and I'm gonna hold you down and make you scream. Teo shivered, pressed the head of his cock in a rubbing tease until Russ growled. That sounds terrible. Please don't do that. Over and over. Russ smiled at the completion of the ritual, the tight burning glide of Terrace's cock spearing inside, more fucking perfect, reverie speeding higher through his veins and biotics flaring over and around their bodies. Terrace groaned, teasing gone, trembling and talons drawing blood, but so far only Russ's blood, not offering his own, and he would pay for that. Later. Now he was lost in the surge and pulse, hips pressed deep and held still, Terrace murmuring fervently against the plate and hide of his back. I miss you when you're gone, R. There is nobody like you. Russ was silent, still perfect but that small ringing hollow of the thought of Garrus, always and familiar, not unwelcome. He could say he missed Terrace when he was gone, and that was true. Affection and lust got him far, got him perfect sex, but he said, Tara, you're still gonna pay. Terrace was panting, tongue and teeth and growl. Spirits, yes. That's the best part. But I gotta tell you now because later I won't be able to form words. Terrace only had and only wanted control for a little while, withholding blood until Russ was provoked into a frenzy, stoked by Terrace's talented hands. Scrapes of teeth and talons, trails of blood as Russ basked in building and ebbing pleasure, letting Terrace wonder when, not if. His mouth watered, anticipation and tense in preparation, power and flaunt, something people expected from an 8-foot Taurian, something he truly enjoyed providing. Now he needed blood, and he could never tell if Terrace even tried to fight it at all. It seemed like it sometimes, but Terrace had never been a hand-to-hand specialist. Likely he never got the chance even if he wanted to, and it ended the same, with Terrace shoved back suddenly, the shock of separation, loss of warm heat, loss of balance, dazed and reverie-stunned. Russ turned him and lifted him like a doll, teeth digging deep into tough hide and muscle at the junction of the back of his neck. Combined blood on his tongue, frenzy, and speed had him driven deep into Terrace. A scream. His first, not his last. Terrace loved Russ's thing. One of his things. biotics that made it hard for him to breathe, blue fire spanning his throat, and an irresistible banded arm around his chest, gasping and begging for more. Here they would stay, sometimes for hours. The sounds he made and the banding throb around his cock, the smell of the man, the taste of his blood, whimpers and gasps, and as promised, no words allowed. And then Terrace would lie panting and exhausted, Russ knowing when they'd both had enough. Ideas and inspirations all played out on hide and plate. Right then, when the grip of frenzy was relaxed, then he'd remember Garrus, the Vicarian body in his arms, a kiss to the back of the neck, a stroke along sensitive fringe, a gentle bite while still joined. They'd stay that way, sleeping for a few hours, and before he drifted off, he knew who he belonged to. The man who could call him R and be right. His last thought before he fell asleep. His first thought in the morning. Garrus. He'd tell Terrace, thank you. His tale, soft and fervent, fall asleep with his chest pressed to an imagined man. Eyes closed, caresses along plate and hide that blurred from lust and affection into love and devotion.